Mr. Spencer, good morning.
Good morning, Peter. How are you?
You know, sometimes you can't help but just slide into a mindset of what can be done.
Well, what can be done? The world situation is an extraordinary mess right now, with our enemies arrayed against our enemies, and the United States disposed in various places to help both sides when we really ought to be staying out of it. And there's no good that can come of anything that we do in any of the situations involved.
Let us, if we could, look at Gaza and Israel. Last night I watched Brian Williams' newscast, as I try to, and they opened with the Israelis shelling on a Gaza beach and killing 4 children playing. And it's so powerful, and it was so awful. And then it showed what was taking place with the Palestinians in Gaza taking the children's bodies and running through the streets, electrifying other people. What are we watching happen?
Well, what we're watching happen is, I don't have all the information. I don't think anybody has all the information about the incident on the beach. The larger picture is that the Israelis are scrupulous about trying to avoid civilian casualties. In any war, it's not possible to avoid all civilian casualties, and especially not possible in Gaza, where Hamas uses the civilians as shields and deliberately mounts attacks from civilian areas so as to provoke retaliatory fire that they can use for propaganda purposes, which they are doing very effectively with this incident with the children on the beach. I'm not saying that it wasn't a terrible thing or that it shouldn't have been avoided and so on, but I don't think the whole story has come out yet. With the Israelis announcing to civilian areas that they're about to start shelling and that people should evacuate, and then instead of evacuating, you have Palestinians rushing to that area and trying to make it more likely that civilians will be killed, it seems to me extraordinarily unlikely that there would just be some random shelling of a beach where nothing is going on but people there having fun and sunning themselves. Probably it will come out in the next days or weeks that there was some rocket installation or bombs. What do you store bombs? But anyway, something that was right there, and that's what they were aiming for. The fact is that in the larger picture, Hamas tries to provoke civilian casualties on both sides and loves civilian casualties on both sides because it uses the deaths of its own civilians to try to demonize the Israelis in the eyes of the world. And it deliberately aims at Israeli civilians on the other side without apology or hesitation.
It's interesting. It was learned in Grant Park in 1968 when the chant begins, the whole world is watching. And last night I was watching Brian Williams, and I'm thinking of that chant, the whole world is watching. And they showed the mother, and it's tragic, the mother of one of the boys who was killed coming down a really tiny street. And there must have been, no exaggeration, Mr. Spencer, 8 to 10 cameras focused on her. And one of the network cameras, I suspect, was focusing on the scene. And I thought to myself, taking nothing away from the deaths, but the whole world is now watching this.
Yeah. And this is just the kind of thing they're waiting for.
Indeed.
This is just the kind of thing they wanted. If you look at the coverage of this whole affair over the last few days and the last week or so, you see that there's a tendency for all the media accounts to carry a death count. And it says Palestinians 240, Israeli 1.
Yeah.
And it's the obvious implication, the obvious point of putting that in the paper or in the reports is to say, see, the Israelis are being brutal and acting unjustly, and the Palestinians are not really doing much of anything wrong. But look, if you look at World War II, the deaths of Germans in World War II was about there were several million Germans killed, and several 100,000 Americans. Does that mean that the Germans were right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously not.
By the way, I want to play something for you. This was given to Mark Crowley. This takes place, and I want you to see it. I know your computer is right in front of you. Let me set this up for everybody. We've played it twice before. You can see this young woman. Now, as you and I have talked about before, there seems to be this propensity or proclivity of young American women becoming Islamized. And I don't know what this is all about. We have this sad case of this high school girl here that was going to go join ISIS. And you watch this video, and she's clearly a U.S. kid, and she speaks like almost like a valley girl, but she's wrapped up in a burqa, and she's a law student, and she appears before this panel that are discussing Benghazi, but you don't know it. The woman's voice is Bridget Gabriel, who I think you know, who is president and CEO of Act for America. But I want you to listen to this, and better yet, watch it, because of watching this girl in her burqa and how she walks up to these people. This is up on our website, 710knus.com. If I could put you on hold and play this, you can hear the audio. In fact, if you want to, Mr. Spencer, jump to our website, 710knus.com, and watch this video. It is so powerful. It just made the case you made about Germans. I'm going to put Robert Spencer on hold. Our website is 710knus.com. You have to see it from the beginning, if you would, son.
Assalamualaikum. Peace to you all. My name is Saba Ahmed. I'm a law student at American University. I am here to ask you a simple question. I know that we portray Islam and all Muslims as that, but there is 1.8 billion Muslim followers of Islam. We have 8 million plus Muslim Americans in this country, and I don't see them represented here. But my question is, how can we fight an ideological war with weapons? How can we ever end this war? The jihadist ideology that you talk about, it's an ideology. How can you ever win this thing if you don't address it ideologically?
Great question. I am so glad you're here, and I am so glad you brought that up because it gives us an opportunity to answer. What I find so amazing is since the beginning of this panel, which we are here about Benghazi attack against our people, not one person mentioned Muslims. We are here against Islam, or we're launching war against Muslims. We are here to discuss how 4 Americans died and what our government is doing. We were not here to bash Muslims. You were the one who brought up the issue about most Muslims, not us. And since you brought it up, allow me to elaborate with my answer. There are 1.2 billion Muslims in the world today. Of course, not all of them are radicals. The majority of them are peaceful people. The radicals are estimated to be between 15 to 25%, according to all intelligence services around the world. That leaves 75% of them peaceful people. But when you look at 15 to 25% of the world Muslim population, you're looking at 180 million to 300 million people dedicated to the destruction of Western civilization. That is as big of the United States. So why should we worry about the radicals, 15 to 25%? Because it is the radicals that kill. Because it is the radicals that behead and massacre. When you look throughout history, when you look at all the lessons of history, most Germans were peaceful. Yet the Nazis drove the agenda. And as a result, 60 million people died. Almost 14 million in concentration camps. 6 million were Jews. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at Russia, most Russians were peaceful as well. Yet the Russians were able to kill 20 million people. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at China, for example, most Chinese were peaceful as well. Yet the Chinese were able to kill 70 million people. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at Japan prior to World War II, most Japanese were peaceful as well. Yet Japan was able to butcher its way across Southeast Asia, killing 12 million people, mostly killed with bayonets and shovels. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. On September 11th in the United States, we had 2.3 million Arab Muslims living in the United States. It took 19 hijackers, 19 radicals to bring America down to its knees, destroy the World Trade Center, attack the Pentagon, and kill almost 3,000 Americans that day. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. So for all our powers of reasons and us talking about moderate and peaceful Muslims, I'm glad you're here. But where are the others speaking out? And since you are the only Muslim representative, applause till the end.
Amazing. Back to Robert Spencer. Again, that video is up, 710knus.com. Wasn't that amazing, Mr. Spencer?
Yeah, and actually it became quite a controversial thing with, there was a story, I don't know if you're aware, right after this, the day after, in, I forget, some liberal rag, saying that this woman had been taunted and abused at a conservative meeting. I think it was in the Washington Post. Mm-hmm. And then it came out that Saba Ahmed, the woman in the hijab asking the question, was not as peaceful or moderate as she appeared to be. She was on Sean Hannity and refused to denounce or reject or oppose any aspect of Sharia, even the stonings and the amputations and the beheadings and the oppression of women and everything else. Wouldn't say a word against it. And it turned out that she has claimed that she was expelled from Republican and Tea Party meetings for being a Muslim, when actually what happened was she claimed falsely that she had been given death threats. And this was investigated, and it was found that she was lying, and so she was expelled for these things. So it's clear that Saba Ahmed is somebody who is, like so many Muslims in America today, working to perpetuate a false idea that Muslims are being unfairly victimized and discriminated against, harassed, and persecuted unjustly. And really, it's most often Muslims themselves who are the ones who are trying to create this impression so that they can receive the privileged status of victimhood, which is so valuable in American society today, and can deflect scrutiny from the fact that so few of them, as Brigitte noted, are doing anything to oppose their violent co-religionists.
Can this nation name its enemy right now? Can the mainstream? No, cannot, can it?
Not a bit. I mean, look, I'll tell you, for example, about the victimization. There's a very prominent imam, a Shiite imam in the Dearborn, Michigan area, named Husham al-Husseini, and he was behind the Muslim TV show a few years back that got so much controversy, and he has addressed the Democratic Convention and so on. He's quite prominent, and a couple weeks ago he was back in the news because there were burned Qurans found on the doorstep of his mosque, and he was posing mournfully with these burned pages and saying that there ought to be a law, and this is the point, because he's called for this before, a law in America against something that hurts the feelings of religious people. In other words, what he wants to do is criminalize something like burning a Quran and criticizing Islam. He wants there to be criminal penalties for it, which is essentially what he wants is that there would be Sharia blasphemy laws in the United States. Anyway, then it turned out that it was a Muslim who burns the Qurans, and the whole incident was staged so that he could make the call for the restriction on the freedom of speech and freedom of expression.
You're not the Reichstag fire. You're not shocked.
Precisely, yeah.
You're listening to Robert Spencer from Jihad Watch. I'd like to return, if we could, for a moment to the situation in Gaza. If Israelis invade, and I don't know what there are people that I read that say it's imminent. The rockets are being fired again this morning, according to what I'm reading on the internet. That a lot of people thought that this so-called ceasefire was simply a chance for Hamas to reload, to bring in water, to bring in more rockets, and they're firing rockets again this morning. If the Israeli military crosses into Gaza, what's going to happen?
Well, I suppose the main thing that will happen, Peter, is that the intensity of the claims that Israel is behaving badly and acting disproportionately will increase exponentially. And there will be calls at the UN for Israel to cease and desist, condemnations of Israel everywhere, a firestorm of outrage against Israel in the international media. And that's happened before, and it stopped Israel several times. I mean, I think it's ironic to note that the other day, Israel was struck. One day last week, Israel was struck from 4 places in one day, from southern Lebanon, from Syria, from Gaza, and from Sinai. Mm-hmm. Now, if you take those 4 places, all except Syria, southern Lebanon, Gaza, and the Sinai, are places that Israel had once occupied and then left voluntarily in order to create peace. Right. And we were told every time that Israel withdrew from Gaza, from southern Lebanon, and from the Sinai, that it would bring about peace, and that the problem was really the Israeli occupation, and that once the Israelis left, there would be peace. And the Israelis bought it, and they left. Mm-hmm. And instead of peace ensuing, the places that they left became bases for new operations against Israel. And so peace did not come, only more war came. And now Israel is faced with the apparent necessity of going back into Gaza, which it left for peace, mm-hmm. and trying to stop the jihad against it once again. And so it's clear that, as we have discussed, Peter, over the years so many times about Iraq and Afghanistan, that the whole enterprise was ill-conceived. The problem was wrongly diagnosed and the wrong solutions applied. So it is here, that the international community constantly presses Israel to make concessions, to withdraw, and the next thing now is the settlements, so-called, in the West Bank, mm-hmm. and that will bring peace. And yet every time they have done this, and they've done this many times, it did not bring peace. It only emboldened their enemies. So why should they heed the international community at this point when every time they have done this, it has turned out exactly the opposite of what was promised?
That was Oslo, right?
Which one?
Oslo Accords, that the Israelis said they would withdraw from parts of Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. You have southern Lebanon in the year mm-hmm. 2000. And you have the withdrawal, that is, mm-hmm. after they had been there for several years because mm-hmm. southern Lebanon was being used as mm-hmm. a jihad base. They left. It's being used as a jihad base again. You have the withdrawal from Gaza in 2006. Same thing. We were promised the Gazans will take up farming. They'll get find gainful employ. They will no longer just be directed against Israel, and they're directed more against Israel than they ever were. And the withdrawal from Sinai was back before that as part of the Camp David Accords, and the withdrawal was finished in 1982. And there again, we were told that this would bring about peace, and now Sinai is yet another base for jihad attacks against Israel.
Let me ask a question, and I take a pause and come back. I read these Palestinians, and they call a place home that they've never been. And oftentimes their fathers have never been there either, but they still call it home. How? And it's fueled by so much, and was fueled by people like the Saudi Arabians and others. Now, with everything that's coming apart, with the wheels coming apart, and I still ask this question: if the Israelis invade, what will that do? And speak about the mindset of the Palestinian who calls a place home that he's never been. Robert Spencer is our guest from Jihad Watch, a huge fan. That video is up, 710knus.com. I set up this question. It's this war between Palestinians and Israelis. We've talked about its roots before, but is it a territorial conflict? Is it a religious conflict? Is it a conflict of civilization? Is it what? How are we best to get our arms around it, Mr. Spencer?
Well, the answer to those 3 questions is all yes. But the primary kind of conflict that it is indeed religious. The Quran says in chapter 2, verse 191, drive them out from where they drove you out. And while it's not actually historically accurate to say that the Israelis drove the Palestinians out of the area. The Muslim leaders actually called upon the Arabs in 1948 to evacuate from areas that Israel was controlling, because all the surrounding Arab states had declared war on Israel, and they figured they would destroy the Jewish state in a few weeks, and then the people could return. As it happened, they lost the war, and they had asked these people to leave, and they were considered then by the Israeli government to be obviously on the side of their enemies, so they weren't allowed back in. But they left voluntarily. In any case, the creation of the State of Israel came after Jews came from all over the world and started buying land, and they bought land that was for sale. They didn't seize or steal land from anyone. And then the Ottoman government and then the Arab states after it began to see the Zionist settlement with alarm, and to send people from all over that area into the place where the Israelis were settling. And they are the Palestinians. There isn't really any distinct Palestinian nationality. This has been completely forgotten and lost nowadays. It was only Newt Gingrich, you may recall, during the 2012 presidential campaign, who raised it, and that was the first time I had seen anybody even mention it in the mainstream for decades. But Yasser Arafat and the Soviets invented the Palestinians in the 1960s. They were just the area Arabs. They're not distinguished ethnically or nationally or in any other way from the Syrians or the Jordanians or the Lebanese. They are just the same Arab people, and there's never been a state of Palestine, a kingdom of Palestine, a Palestinian government. There is no Palestinian history or culture. It is all completely made up, because the world opinion was, at that time, in the 60s, completely in favor of Israel as one tiny Jewish state surrounded by huge hostile Arab states. And the Soviets and Yasser Arafat very deftly and cleverly completely subverted that paradigm and changed it by creating an even tinier people that would be surrounded and besieged by the monstrous Jewish state. And they successfully sold this to the international media and even to the UN and to the Israelis themselves. But it's the entire Palestinian people. The whole concept of the Palestinian people is a propaganda fiction that was created in order to have a stick to beat Israel with.
When I read them, they claim they are the descendants of Philistines, that in the Old Testament, when, of course, it's David's tribe, and he meets Goliath, and I think
there's absolutely zero historical basis.
Well, but that's their claim. They claim they claim their name, or at least my reading suggests, they claim their name Palestinian from Philistine.
Yeah, the name comes from that.
Yeah.
But the Romans did that on purpose.
Indeed.
What happened was the Romans were faced with the Judeans, the Jews, in the area of what is now modern Israel, and they rebelled. They never were happy with Roman rule, and there was always tension. You can see it in the New Testament at the time of Jesus, and there were some people who were hoping that the Messiah was going to be somebody who would revolt against the Romans,
a military leader.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the Romans came and destroyed the Jewish temple in 70 A.D. because of these rebellions, and then there was another revolt in 134 A.D., the Bar Kokhba revolt, whereupon all the Jews were expelled from the area, and the area was at that time renamed Palestine. It was given the name Palestine instead of Judea by the Romans because they wanted to erase the Jewish presence from the area. And so they reached back into the mists of time, into history, the spiritual, religious history of the Bible, and picked out the name of the ancient enemies of the Israelites, the Philistines, and gave them gave the area that name. And so ever after that it was used as a geographical designation for that area. But then at that time, there was no Palestinian people. The people who were there were the Jews, and then they were expelled and other people brought in, and the name Palestine given to the area. But there never were, in all these transactions, there never were any Palestinians.
Did not the British particularly during and after the time of Lawrence, they called it Palestine, did they not?
Yes, sure they did. Because after the Romans called it Palestine in the 2nd century, that became the name of the area. But it was a geographical designation. It was never the designation for a nation of people and a distinct nationality and ethnicity. That was never the case.
Is it
until now?
I have read, and again, and Isaac, my source on this is Isaac Deutscher, the great historian who did Trotsky and did Stalin and did the best of the Hitler books, and Deutscher said, and he made a great case. He said these guys are so much alike, and you're the great person to bounce this off. He said the role that the Palestinian played in the Middle East was the identical role that the Jewish guys play in Europe prior to the Holocaust. That they are the intelligentsia, the physicians, the musicians, the bankers, the lawyers, the brightest, and that role was played by Jews in Europe who are stateless in many places, unable to gain citizenship in many places, and the so-called Palestinian plays that same role in the Middle East.
Of being the intelligentsia?
Yes.
I think that's rather preposterous,
right.
Peter. I'm sorry.
No, it's not my theory. It is.
Yeah,
it's Isaac Deutscher, himself Jewish, by the way.
Maybe I'm not understanding what he's saying.
Well, he's saying that they're more alike than different. In other words, the role that the Palestinian who becomes this stateless character as well.
Well, I see that connection. Yeah. That you have the stateless people that is sort of a thorn in the side of everybody around.
Yeah.
It also should be noted that the surrounding Arab states don't like the Palestinians either. That none of them. Only Jordan would give them citizenship after 1948, and so they artificially prolonged the refugee problem.
And then, of course, they attempt to turn on the Jordanians, do they not?
Yes, they did. And so now they're not allowed into Jordan either.
Then they get expelled.
The immigrants, yeah.
They get expelled, and that sets up Lebanon, right?
Yeah, and then the whole big problem with the refugee camps in Lebanon, and the Lebanese didn't want the Palestinians there.
And that's the rise.
And so
is that the rise of that's the rise of Arafat?
Nobody wants them around, but where I think the analogy fails is that they're certainly not the intelligentsia in any country or in any controlling or even remotely close to controlling situation, and also that they're not persecuted. You know, they have this great victimhood industry like Saba Ahmed and a very huge sense of self-pity. But in reality, they're not persecuted. In Gaza, which has been called outrageously the world's largest open-air concentration camp, in reality, they're showered with billions of dollars from the United States, from the European Union, from the United Nations. They're the world's biggest welfare cases. There's 5-star hotels in Gaza. But what concentration camp ever had 5-star hotels? If you look at the pictures of the area, there's sumptuous homes and markets overflowing with goods. They're not hurting in Gaza, and it's all just fiction that's created for propaganda purposes. This
notion of people calling a place home that they've never been. I'm struck by that. I've been reading it quite a bit and trying to go into the mind of at least trying to understand what I'm reading.
Well, it's the refugee status.
Indeed,
that this is the first time in history that refugee status has been accorded to the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the refugees themselves. And it's all because they want to prolong this as something they can use to beat Israel. After World War II, there were millions of refugees in the world. There were millions of people displaced in Europe of all nationalities. There was the huge problem created by the creation of Pakistan out of India, and millions
I'm reading
of
that
Muslims
right
living
now.
in Pakistan.
Yeah, I'm reading the transfer.
Millions of Hindus.
I'm reading the transfer that when partition comes, and it's really interesting because it's partition again, and again it comes back to the British, but under Louis Mountbatten, then there's partition. There's going to be Pakistan, there's going to be India, and Hindus flee to India, and Muslims flee to Pakistan, and the estimated murders, 500,000 Hindus and Muslims are murdered, 47, 48, and 49. Again, we don't talk about that, or it isn't given attention, but when partition comes, the Muslims rip out the throats of the Hindus, and the Hindus rip out the throats of the Muslims, and then the war is declared. And of course, that's when Gandhi is murdered. Gandhi is murdered by a fellow Hindu, murders Gandhi.
Yes.
And I saw the same thing, and I'm thinking to myself, once again, it's my theories that I see, and I think, well, here are the British involved again, partitioning, and have not we talked about partition in Palestine?
Yes. Well, it's still the stated policy of the United States government and the British government and pretty much every concerned party that there ought to be a two-state solution, and Barack Obama has called for the creation of a Palestinian state that would live side by side in peace with the Israeli state, and everything will be okay. And people think that this is actually going to solve the problem. But it's just like what we were talking about a little while ago, Peter, that the withdrawal from Gaza, the withdrawal from Sinai, the withdrawal from southern Lebanon did not bring peace, nor will the creation of a Palestinian state bring peace. Nor
did it with Pakistan and India.
Right, because it's a religious conflict.
Absolutely.
The Hamas charter says, is an epigraph at the top of it. It's a quote from the Muslim Brotherhood founder Hassan al-Banna, and it says, the Jewish state will arise and will remain until Islam obliterates it.
Yeah.
Now, Islam, that's a religious concept, and so it's a religious war that's never going to be solved by negotiation.
But, it's really interesting, and I'm running past the Hindu system is political as well as religious. The caste system is a religious system, but it's a political system. And I'm deeply entrenched again in Louis Mountbatten being sent there, and they partition these countries that they've occupied, and the minute that they step back, it's almost like the death of Tito or the ouster of Saddam. They go right at each other, don't they?
Absolutely, because the partition is something imposed from without that outsiders think, the British primarily, is going to solve the problem. It arises from a faulty, inadequate understanding of what the problem is, where it comes from.
500,000 people were murdered. Somebody sent me this, Mr. Spencer, and I don't know if I read you this or not, but it was, and I want you to do a take asking, are you confused by what's going on in the Middle East? ? Let me explain. We support the Iraqi government in a fight against ISIS. We don't like ISIS, but ISIS is supported by Saudi Arabia, who we do like. We don't like Assad in Syria, but Assad's Air Force is striking ISIS inside of Iraq. We support the fight against him, but ISIS is also fighting against him. We don't like Iran, but Iran supports the Iraqi government in its fight against ISIS. So some of our friends support some of our enemies. Some of our enemies are now our friends. Some of our enemies are fighting against our other enemies who we want to lose. But we don't want our enemies who we are fighting our enemies to win. If people we want to defeat are defeated, they could be replaced by people we like even less. All of this was started by us invading Iraq to drive out terrorists who were not actually there. And now, of course, they are. It's quite simple, really. Do you understand it now?
Yes, that's where we are.
Wow.
It's a complete mess, and it is largely attributable to the wrong solutions that were applied to the problem after 9/11.
If the Israelis move into Gaza, what will that do to, going back to, as we talked about, I think once before, during the first Gulf War, the Israelis wanted to strike Baghdad, and they were sitting on the runways with their canopies up, and George Bush, George 41, was actually paying to paying money to the Israelis so they would not attack, knowing that if they attacked, the coalition would fall apart, and that no matter what would ever happen, anytime an Israeli would strike an Arab country, all other Arab countries would pour down on Israel. So American tax dollars paid for all the damage the Scuds did inside of Israel when Saddam was firing Scuds into Israel to trigger the turn in the war. Given all the insanity we're watching right now, if the Israelis jump across into Gaza, what will that do to the rest of the mess?
Well, it's possible that it could inflame the situation such that all the Muslim states declare war and try to invade Israel. It's possible. On the other hand, they're so caught up with the Sunni-Shiite conflict right now in Syria and Iraq that I don't think that's going to happen. And I think that if I could be wrong, but I think if the Israelis go into Gaza, there'll be a lot of wailing in the mainstream media and a lot of international condemnations, but I don't think it's likely that the Arab states are going to act.
Who, if you were to ask ISIS who they hate most, who would they hate most? Is there a list of people like we've talked about? I had the opportunity, simply because of you, to read Osama bin Laden and who he hated, and who he marked as his single, how do I say this, his enemies and how he ranked them. Who do the ISIS people dislike the most? Are they like Osama in hating the royal houses first?
I think that if you ask the ISIS, the Islamic State people, they would say that yes, they hate the non-Sharia Muslim governments the most, because they actually issued a statement not long ago saying yes, they want to go against Israel, but their first priority is to defeat people like Maliki in Iraq and Assad in Syria, who are the leaders of states that are populated by Muslims but do not rule according to Islamic law. And then they're going to establish Islamic law, set up their caliphate, and then turn against Israel.
Can you imagine what's taking place, I'm sure you can, in Kabul right now, where they're trying to even figure out who is going to be the heir? And they sent, of all people, John Kerry to fathom, I know you and I both laugh at that, to fathom out the outcome of that election. It's now over a month and there's been no declared winner.
Well, it's just, John Kerry doesn't know anything, and he goes in and says to everyone that they have to make concessions and reach an accord. And it's kind of ridiculous because what it is essentially the attempt to apply the way American politics works or is supposed to work to situations where there has never been that kind of conflict resolution or solution to problems. And it's naive and embarrassing.
I was reading somebody the other night, I forget, on your list of people to read, who said John Kerry thinks that he's going to go to Kabul and it's going to be like a Supreme Court making a decision between Al Gore and George W. Bush. And he said, there's not a chance in hell.
Nope, that's exactly it, yeah.
And all they do, only thing left for this government to control is Kabul.
Yes, absolutely. And when the Americans are finally gone, if the Americans ever finally leave, then they won't even have that, and the Taliban will come back.
Wow. I don't know, sir. What would you like to leave us with this morning?
Well, the world is mad. It's getting madder, and it's all we can do is try to keep our head and hope that some sanity will return. But I think it's going to be a lot more bloodshed, and it's going to get a lot worse before that starts to happen. I
always said, and I wish 10 years ago we could have started going to Vegas and betting on your predictions, because, and tragically, I suspect you're right again. Mr. Spencer, for everything you've always done for us, it's Jihad Watch is the website. Mr. Robert Spencer, there's no one better. Thank you, sir. We'll talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Spencer, good morning.